Welcome back. Good to have your company this Friday morning. Now, here's something we haven't seen before. These images yesterday at Uluru, where hundreds of visitors lined up to climb the iconic landmark while they can. It has drawn comparisons to recent scenes on Mount Everest, and large queues are expected again today before a ban on the climb officially takes effect tomorrow, out of respect to local Indigenous people who deem Uluru sacred. It's a decision that's divided opinion, so to discuss it, we're joined by Senator Malarndirri McCarthy from Canberra and 2GB and 4BC's Ben Fordham. Good morning. Welcome to you both.
Morning, Senator.
Good morning.
Malarndirri, if I could begin with you, how does that make you feel, seeing those images from yesterday and recent days where people have really scrambled to get there to climb the rock?
Look, it's certainly not a surprise, Georgie. We've seen that perhaps over the last month or months, really. And I think like anything that's coming to an end, there's always a desire to want to touch and feel. But from my personal perspective, you know, as a Yanyuwa woman, I remember when the rock was handed back to the Arnhem people, and I was only a teenage girl at the time, and I'm feeling enormously proud of them. I feel that they've been able to display the importance of Anangu story and culture and Gujiga, and I just think that you know, it's going to be a momentous day for the people who actually live and surround that very spiritual place.
I feel very blessed having been to Uluru myself. I've been a couple of times, and until you actually see it for yourself, you can't really understand how extraordinary it is. It's just
very much.
It is just the most beautiful spiritual place.
Absolutely.
And Ben, obviously, there are some who are suggesting that this is not the way to go, that it should be this tourist icon and people should be allowed to climb it.
Well, I think it's a natural thing that if you put a rock or a mountain in front of man or woman, that man or woman is going to be fascinated with what's at the top of it. And I've never climbed it. I've never been to Uluru, which is a massive regret of mine.
It's not too late. I
know it's not too late. I know you've climbed it as a young person, so I'd be interested to know what it's like when you get to the top of it. But some of the commentary around the people who are choosing to do it now, I've seen, you know, headlines around white privilege and things like that. I think that's a little bit unfair. I think it's more than a little bit unfair when you consider that there is a history here of people climbing this rock. There's now been a democratic process involving the Parks Council that's deemed that it's no longer to be climbed, and I think we need to respect that democratic process. But equally, I don't think it's a reasonable thing to shame people for doing something that's happened for thousands of years, and the Senator will know better than I do, but I gather was first done by Indigenous Australians. But you tell me, Georgie, what was it like going to the top?
It was extraordinary. I did it as a 16-year-old, and at that stage there wasn't a lot of this sort of discussion. Well, in fact, there wasn't, as far as I knew, there was no discussion about it. But absolutely now, if I was to go, I certainly wouldn't climb it. But there's a part of me that's really thrilled that I did have the experience, because it is mind-blowing, and the view from the top was amazing. But what I remember...
But, Georgie, you shouldn't feel ashamed of it. I mean, seriously, there are so many Australians and people from around the world who have done that, and that's been the generosity of the Anangu over decades. And I think really it's, you know, this is more about the coming together, I think, in Australia, that we are acknowledging the importance of First Nations people in our place, in our history here in this country, but around the world. And I think certainly when people gather together at Uluru for the closing of the climb ceremony, it will be deeply spiritual and significant.
I think Pauline Hanson's visit was probably a bit of a line in the sand moment as well, and that I didn't appreciate
how difficult the climb
was. And so when I'd read things about the number of people who've passed away on the rock from falling or having accidents, that seemed like a statistic on a piece of paper. And then you have a look at clearly a very difficult challenge that Pauline Hanson undertook and couldn't manage to do it, ended up sliding back down on a backside. That probably rammed home that message about danger as well.
Yeah, and take into consideration today, when people are doing that last scramble to try and get to the top, I think temperatures are forecast around 40 degrees there today.
Well, it's already 34 degrees there now, Georgie, and it's 5 a.m. in the morning, so that gives an indication, and safety has always been a real critical concern too.
Absolutely. All right, let's move on and talk about an issue that is also getting plenty of coverage, and for good reason. All this week, we have taken the Today Show to far-flung communities keenly feeling the effects of the drought, and we have showcased the incredible spirit of those in the face of adversity. Today, news that drought-declared farmers and businesses could be made exempt from income tax under a new plan being considered by the government. Ben, that's a measure I would assume everyone would welcome.
There's clearly more announcements coming from the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, on the drought. He's, I think, to a degree, been somewhat motivated to make some further announcements because he's realised the sentiment out there in the community. And this is not something that's being felt in the bush, it's being felt in the big smoke as well. I think people are so sad about what they're seeing, and we're seeing images of that sadness now, that somehow manifests into anger at whoever's in charge. And even though I'm sure Scott Morrison has been doing everything he possibly can to support people in drought-ravaged areas, people want more. Barnaby Joyce yesterday said, I want another $1.3 billion to be pumped into these communities. There's a suggestion that there could be a HEC-style scheme. You know, we underwrite banks when banks are in trouble. We underwrite students when students are starting their education. So why can't we underwrite farmers who are doing it tough in the drought? So watch this space. I think the Prime Minister's got more announcements to make.
Malarndirri, the overwhelming message from those directly affected by this drought is that it hasn't been given the sense of emergency that we see when there's, for example, floods or bushfires. There's been such a slow uptake of measures that we're now finally starting to see unveiled. What are your thoughts on that, the inaction?
Yeah, sure, Georgie. No, you're right. We've just had Senate estimates here in Canberra this week, and certainly in inquiries that I've been involved with, you know, farmers, people from regional and rural Australia have given evidence. And Ben's right, you know, there have been issues around education. You know, the ICPA, for example, wants so much more support for their children. I think there's some really practical measures that can actually happen now. You don't need a gathering of people and more meetings and more meetings. People out there are desperate. They need action now. You know, the mental health worries, Georgie, the suicides and attempted suicide rates that keep coming through in our inquiries is absolutely heartbreaking. And I think, you know, there are very clear things that can be done now. You know, the money that's being talked about in the billions, but it's not landing in simple resources like mental health programs, like support for families, like increasing support for the ICPA and those children who are going away for school, like just some really practical measures that could be done right now.
Absolutely, and I think also people are screaming out to put politics aside. This is this has got to be bipartisan.
Absolutely, and we've offered that.
We also shouldn't pretend it's easy. You know, I mean, I think sometimes people, and we all do, when you're not in a position of power, it's very easy to say, oh, come on, why aren't they doing more? Ultimately, it's not raining, and there's no rain on the horizon. The rain is what we need. The rain is the only thing that will break the drought, and everything else is needed to look after people in the meantime. But let's not kid ourselves. The one thing we need can't be delivered from any politician.
Well said. All right, we will be speaking to our politicians a little shortly, actually, on the show. We'll be putting a lot of these things to them both. Thank you both very much today. Have a happy weekend.
No worries.